Hey everyone, and welcome to video 3 of week 1. In this video, I want to talk about comparing philosophy with science and other fields so we can sort of get a sense of how philosophy goes about trying to answer philosophical questions and to discover new philosophical theories and things like that, because it's often different from how other fields work. So for example, historically, there have been lots of questions about what philosophy is. Philosophers and others have tried to answer that question, and there have been a lot of different answers throughout the millennia. And one answer that was historically very popular is that philosophy and science both study the world and try to find out what's true, but science studies empirical questions that can be solved empirically, where empirical means from observation or experience. So science tries to answer questions empirically, answer the questions that can be answered empirically by experiments and by observations. So for example, an astrophysicist answers questions about space and the universe by observing stars and planets and supernovas and nebulas and whatnot. And by observing those, can draw conclusions about how the world works, about gravity, and how old the universe has been, and things like that. By observation, they come to these conclusions and can answer these questions. A biologist looks at cells and other organisms to find out information about how life on this planet developed and what life on this planet is like. They can answer questions about living things by examining and testing organisms, living things. Those are empirical methods to solving questions. Philosophy, on the other hand, historically, has been thought to be non-empirical, like math. Mathematics asks questions, but they're not solvable by empirical means. Usually. In order to find out that 2 plus 2 equals 4, you don't run around, all right, grab 2 pencils in one hand, 2 pencils in another hand, 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, it worked with those. Now I'll get 2 chairs and 2 more chairs, 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, it works for chairs. Now I'll try it with trees. Now I'll try it with cups. Like, that's just not how math works. You don't run around gathering experience and observations to find out that 2 plus 2 equals 4. You just calculate it, or you do some sort of proof to prove that these two things must be equal. And that applies both to simple math like 2 plus 2 equals 4, and it applies to more complex math like trying to answer Goldbach's conjecture and prove whether it's true or false, that every even number greater than 2 is the sum of 2 prime numbers. That's a mathematical question about numbers. And it's either true or false. Either there is an even number that's not the sum of 2 primes, or there isn't. But you can't solve that question empirically. You can't go out and observe the numbers because numbers aren't physical things that are just out there to be looked at. So math has to answer its questions, like whether or not Goldbach's conjecture is true, not with empirical data, not with observations and experiments, but with what are called a priori methods. And we'll talk about this. I'm going to put up a video explaining the a priori, a posteriori distinction. But basically, the thought is mathematics has to use a priori methods to answer its questions. It has to use methods that are independent of observation and experience. So you sit down and you prove things logically, just with pen and paper or just in your head, you prove something. And that has been going on for thousands of years. To find out that the square root of 2 is irrational, meaning it's not equal to any fraction with whole numbers on the top and bottom. In order to prove that, mathematicians didn't go out and measure things that were the square root of 2 inches long or anything like that. They we're able to prove it logically. Start from the assumption that it is equal to some fraction, and then you derive a contradiction. And that proves that it can't possibly be equal to any fraction. It's purely a priori in the sense that it doesn't rely on going out and observing the world and getting evidence and data in that way. You just can sit and think through it very carefully, and you can prove that it's true, that the square root of 2 is irrational. Whereas you can't do that in physics. You cannot prove the existence of black holes by sitting down with a pen and paper and thinking really hard about it. No matter how hard you think about it, you will never prove whether or not there are black holes. You'll never figure out what dark matter is. You'll never figure out quantum gravity by just sitting in a room with pen and paper. You have to go out and look at the world and make observations and run experiments and test things and get empirical data. That's how you answer physics questions and chemistry questions and other science questions. Whereas math, you can't answer its questions that way. Observation of the world and experiments will not answer mathematical questions. And it was thought that philosophy is like that. Philosophy is like math. Philosophy is a priori as a discipline, was the historical answer. Philosophy uses non-empirical methods to answer questions that cannot be solved empirically, like whether or not God exists, or whether or not it's okay to have the death penalty, or whether or not mercy killings or euthanasia are ever morally permissible, or how much evidence you have to have in order to be justified in believing something. These are questions that you can't go out and just measure something or look at data and just observe and find out the answer. You have to sit down and think through it carefully. And hopefully, eventually, if you do that, you will find the right answer or find a plausible answer. And philosophers have thought that for a very long time, and many philosophers still think that now. But some philosophers no longer think that this distinction is quite right, because many philosophical debates have been informed by empirical data. For example, since at least the time of Plato, some philosophers have wondered about whether or not matter is infinitely divisible. So, if you have a block of clay, you can chop it in half, and then you can take one of those halves and chop it in half, and take that half and chop it in half, and keep getting smaller and smaller. And philosophers ask, in principle, in theory, could this go on forever? Or is there some smallest amount of matter that can't possibly be split in half? And for a long time, people thought that atoms were those. Then it turns out you can split the atom. That's how we have nuclear weapons and things like that. Atoms have parts that can be separated. And then, like the nucleus of an atom has parts that can be separated. And you get a proton, and a proton has parts that can be separated. And so the question was, can that go on forever? Are there always smaller parts? And now anyone trying to answer that question who doesn't look to physics is in trouble. Physics, empirical data, and empirical evidence and observations from physics give us really good reason to think that that question might be a mistake from the get-go. That may be due to particle wave duality, which we're not going to talk about in this class because it's a whole physics issue that it would take us too far out of our wheelhouse. But that question can't be answered without some empirical data. You need the physics data to try to figure out this question about what happens at the smallest level of matter. When you get down to the smallest parts, can they be divided further or can they not be divided further? That question should not be attempted without looking at empirical stuff. But it's still a philosophical question. Questions about how the mind works or questions about how language works can be very well informed by empirical observation. Linguists have gone out into the field and gotten data which has been very useful and very important to philosophers of language trying to solve conceptual issues and answer foundational questions about how language works, where meaning comes from, how a word can mean something, how a word that you say or a thought in your head can have a meaning, can represent something out there in the world. That is a philosophical, we're not really going to talk about that much in this class, but that's a philosophical question that is very dependent on some empirical observations about how people actually use language out there in the world. That's empirical data that is useful to solve this philosophical question. So philosophy focuses a lot on a priori issues that are discovered prior to going out and looking at the world and getting observations, prior to experience, prior to empirical data. And that is still a big part of philosophy, but it is no longer the only part of philosophy. Philosophy can be informed by empirical data, and empirical methods can be very useful to philosophers. I co-authored a paper trying to do empirical experiments on language use to try to answer philosophical questions about reference. That can be a very useful tool. So that is no longer exactly the case. This historical distinction between empirical methods and questions for science and non-empirical methods and questions for philosophy. Now, many philosophers are what's called naturalists about philosophy, meaning they think that philosophy is continuous with the natural sciences like physics and chemistry and biology and whatnot, in some sense. That there is no sharp distinction. There can be fuzzy boundaries, especially in some areas, like interpreting quantum field theory is done by both philosophers and physicists who sometimes work together and argue about the same issue. And are they doing philosophy? Are they doing physics? It's a little fuzzy. Cognitive science, for example. Some of the foundational thinkers at the start of cognitive science were philosophers who were thinking about what minds have to be like in order to explain our success in thinking about the world and moving around and surviving and discussing things and sharing ideas. And philosophers still are a big part of cognitive science. And cognitive science is a science. But it is a science that includes many philosophers who identify themselves as philosophers. So the boundary between science and philosophy is not as sharp as we once thought it was. So empirical methods can definitely be relevant to philosophy, and philosophers can perform experiments and get empirical data and make observations to try to help answer the kinds of questions that they're interested in. So one way to make the distinction between philosophers and scientists is just the kinds of questions they're interested in. In the same way that you might make a distinction between a mathematician who's interested in knowing what follows from a certain set of axioms, from a philosopher of math who's more interested in how we choose axioms, how we justify these axioms as the right axioms, as true axioms. Because an axiom, by definition, is the starting point of your proof. So you can't prove that the axioms are true in a mathematical proof. You have to assume the axioms. And what justifies that assumption, or how we can justify that assumption, is a philosophical question that philosophers of math try to answer. Whereas mathematicians don't answer that question as much. That's not as interesting to them as like open questions about group theory or prime numbers or things like that. And so you might make a similar distinction in science. So philosophers are interested in certain questions, normative questions like what should we do, what should we not do? Is it okay to get an abortion or to kill someone in self-defense? When is it okay for a government to start a war? Is that ever okay? Or is the government that starts a war always in the wrong? Those are all questions that are normative questions, meaning they're about what we should or shouldn't do. And those can't be answered empirically. So philosophy needs to look at non-empirical methods to try to answer those questions. And clearly those questions matter, right? Whether or not it's okay for a government to invade your country is a serious question that you should probably want to know the answer to. And that's a philosophical question that can't be solved by empirical means. And so these sorts of normative questions are definitely part of philosophy. And those are things philosophers care about that scientists, I mean, they may care about it on their own time, but they don't care about it as scientists when studying science. And so philosophers are interested in more foundational questions about what causation is, or about how much evidence we need in order to believe a scientific theory, or what sort of picture of the world is best supported by the equations that turn out to govern how particles move, what we should conclude about the nature of a particle from these equations. Those are questions that are probably more interesting to philosophers than they are to scientists. And so trying to answer those questions, whether or not you're using empirical methods, is more in the wheelhouse of philosophy than it is in science. And that's less about what methods you're using than it is about what kinds of questions interest you. Foundational questions and conceptual questions are philosophical, whereas, how old is the universe, and what's the right theory of quantum gravity, and how many phylums of bacteria are there? Those are purely scientific questions that aren't really foundational. You need a foundation in order to start asking those questions. And so those are not philosophical questions in that sense. So philosophers can rely on empirical methods, but they often need to rely on non-empirical methods in order to answer philosophical questions, because what they're interested in are often questions that cannot be solved by empirical means. But they are still questions that have a correct answer. Either there is a God or there is not a God. Either there is at least one God or there are no gods. Right? Those are the two options. And that's not a matter of opinion or preference. There is a real fact there. And whether or not we can answer that question is itself a philosophical question. But if we can answer that question, then the way we answer it is going to have to be non-empirical. It's going to have to be a philosophical method, a non-empirical, a priori philosophical method that we use to try to answer that question. And we will look at that later in the course. We will look at a set of philosophical arguments. One that tries to prove that God must exist, another that tries to prove that God must not exist. And they are both supposed to be what are called deductively valid arguments, which is a method that philosophers use that we will talk about 2 weeks from now, on week 3. And so we will, over the course of this semester, we will start to learn slowly, learn some of the methods that philosophers use to try to solve these questions. And we will learn them by practicing them, by looking at philosophical issues like what knowledge is, whether or not God exists, whether or not the death penalty is okay, and things like that will give us the opportunity to try to explore these issues and use philosophical methods and create our own philosophical arguments to try to answer these questions for ourselves. And so that's all I want to talk about this week. Next week, we will begin practicing philosophy by examining knowledge and investigating the concept of knowledge, trying to figure out what knowledge is. So if you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, I will see you in the video next week.